While in my hometown of McAllen, Texas, seeking a brief reprieve from graduate school, I ran into one of my previous middle school teachers at the local grocery store, who asked me what I was now doing, and to which I proudly replied, "I'm a PhD student at UT Austin, studying material science and engineering," like I was some kind of superhero. Her face became radiant and thrilled to learn that one of her former pupils had reached a high level of success and would later brag to her colleagues. She then asked me what my research was about. I attempted to choose my words carefully, because saying something like, "I'm investigating the momentum-dependent splitting in spin bands in two-dimensional topological insulator chalcogenide-type materials for potential applications in nanoelectronics," and expect her to understand. As I began to respond, I was overcome with a mental paralysis, which seemed like an eternity. And at that moment, I realized I had no idea what I was doing. Not only from a research perspective, but also questioning my pursuit of the PhD. This was not unusual. A PhD will build you up and break you down in a Promethean fashion. In order to avoid such awkward situations, here's a bit of advice. Try to respond to PhD-related questions with euphemisms. For instance, if someone asks you what your research is about, tell them it's classified or confidential, when in reality, you have no clue. Later that evening, as I was preparing for bed, I washed my face and looked at myself in the mirror. Something was wrong. I couldn't see my reflection. Startled, I rubbed my eyes and looked at the mirror again. And this time, I saw an image of my former self just before I entered graduate school. I wanted to pull him by his shirt, pin him against the wall, and slap him and say, "No, don't do it!" A PhD is a zero-sum game. Having a PhD won't make you smarter, richer, or famous. Closing my eyes again, I fell into a cathartic and almost out-of-body experience. The academic title doctor is a Latin word that means to teach. Originally, the PhD was awarded for advanced scholarship and as a license to teach. No dissertation was required. Then, in the 19th century, the PhD was granted to someone who completed original research in the sciences or humanities, which has now become the bane of obtaining a PhD. For example, only about 57% of students will finish their PhD within 10 years of starting graduate school. Moreover, the average student takes 8.2 years to complete their PhD. And the long-term financial benefits, you may ask? Casey research showed that having a PhD provided a 26% increase in salary, but noted that a master's degree provided a similar 23% increase. Yet every fall, a fresh crop of PhD candidates will arrive at UT Austin. What exactly is the incentive to pursue this special type of torture? So you can write obscure papers that only a handful of people can read? A PhD forms a subculture, where certain stories and symbols resonate with the PhD identity. Sociologists define a lifestyle as the interests, opinions, and behaviors of an individual, group, or culture. Likewise, a PhD is a way of life, possessing its own set of beliefs and values, such as publish or perish. You can even argue it's an alternative lifestyle, like an adrenaline junkie, because PhDs put themselves through unnecessary distress. A similar culture exists in the fast-paced, high-stakes games at Silicon Valley. In the startup culture, the motto of demo or die creates such an immense pressure to succeed that depression and even suicide are starting to take root. A PhD has both a Kafkaesque and magical realism quality to it. You have to learn to accept the absurdity, not for its ugliness, but its beauty, and even suspend reality in order to make sense of it sometimes. The only way to escape this nightmare is to meaningfully extend the boundaries of human knowledge. However, a PhD raises more questions than it answers. As you progress further into your PhD, you begin to learn less about a subject and not more. You finally appreciate those assumptions made in your undergraduate engineering textbooks, such as Newtonian fluid. Unlike an undergraduate degree, a PhD does not have a precise timetable for completion, which can create difficulties in staying motivated. The uncertainty of, what if I can't figure this problem out, can drive us mad. You can't Google your dissertation title, and you can't look in the back of the book for answers. Research is not instantly gratifying, and the wait for an elusive discovery can be a painstakingly slow process. So tell me, how can I get a PhD in the minimum amount of time with the minimum amount of damage? Unfortunately, that is a fantasy. A PhD student is an indentured servant whose freedom is granted after satisfactory research work as determined by your advisor. However, you're expected to learn research skills on the fly. During your weekly meeting with your advisor, you'll go through 3 emotions: despair, doubt, and desperation, and in that order. A PhD can be more bureaucratic than academic, and playing political games is vital. Poor advisors create poor PhDs, which in turn become poor advisors. Fortunately, the next generation of PhD graduates have the power to end this self-perpetuating cycle of pain. The trinity of qualifications, dissertation, and defense is a baptism by fire, presided by your committee from hell. Ultimately, the only person that actually reads your dissertation is the next PhD student. A PhD can make you emotionally detached. Frustration will turn into depression, and depression will turn into an inevitable existential crisis. You'll find yourself attending esoteric seminars, and in order to make any intelligible comment is to ask, have you looked at the temperature dependence? Not to mention plowing through journal papers, or navigating bitter and jaded lab mates, or working on the weekends and holidays. Research can be extremely solitary and antisocial, creating a schism between friends and family. The duties of teaching assistant, research assistant, and student will consume you. And with the free time that you do have, you'll find yourself in a Netflix binge. And then there are factors outside of your control, such as your project running out of funding, your advisor leaving, or your project being swooped. My PhD journey has been a fun but terrifying experience, and I'm no stranger to the throes of graduate school. For instance, my first advisor left. I've had to switch projects multiple times, and for these reasons, I'm a third-year graduate student with no journal publications, which is how success is measured in academia. No matter how bad things got, I was not alone. Visiting PhD offices is like visiting a wounded animal shelter, where PhD students are confined in their cubicle fences, yearning to be adopted and saved from their misery. And not all PhDs are devoid of love and compassion. And at times, there's a sense of humanity displayed within the PhD fraternity. I remember when one PhD student performed the selfless act of allowing his colleague to have the distinction of first author on a journal paper so that he could graduate after toiling for years in the PhD doldrums. Hopefully, the next time you see your teaching assistant, lab assistant, or grader, you'll be cognizant of their plight. A PhD is not emblematic of the principle survival of the fittest, because even the brightest are unable to obtain the superlative degree. Rather, it's a prism of curiosity. Certain aspects of life can be an unbearable and unhealthy grind, such as school or work. Determining whether what we are doing is worth it depends on if it's a challenge or a burden to us. In order to find meaning lies at the intersection of not only our intellectual and emotional aptitude, but also our curiosity level. That is not to say we don't need a total reform of PhD programs across the United States. Finally, I awakened from my deep trance, looked at myself in the mirror, and simply smiled. I realized if I were doing anything else instead of a PhD, I would be bored. Thank you.